get started in a minute or two, but feel free to get beverages or snacks.
Oh my goodness. I love the awkward silence before a live stream. Is that for like global campus students or whatever you call it?
Guess we'll start. I'll turn on the mic. So thanks for coming out. I know it's cold and it was snowing earlier, but I'm Matt Gowerty, an assistant professor of sociology here at EOU. For this event, first I want to thank a couple of our sponsors. So we had Rev help with this event, so the Rural Engagement and Vitality Center. Grace in particular, they're doing great work out there connecting EOU students and faculty expertise with the local communities around here. Moonshot for Equity, so Julie, they're doing great stuff, making our campus more equitable. I also see this presentation building off this common read that came out of here, Justin Farrell's Billionaire Wilderness. So there's actually comparisons, I think. The EOU Foundation, they had a generous grant to make this event possible. The College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Science, so Nate, Cassie, Kayla, providing all the background support to help carry out this event. And then the Anthropology and Sociology program. We've been trying to have a sociology speaker series, and this is our first year trying this, and this is our second event. Hopefully it's interesting.
I'll do what I
interesting
can.
conversations and discussions for everyone on campus. So I would like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Sherman. She's a professor of sociology at Washington State University. She is currently serving as the president of the Rural Sociological Society. Her research focuses on poverty, inequality, rural communities, gender, and family, and it's been published in some of the top journals in sociology, social problems, and social forces. She uses qualitative methods, and she's investigated issues facing families in Northern California, timber community, rural and urban communities in New England, and then agricultural and tourism dependent communities in the Pacific Northwest. Her most recent work, Dividing Paradise, Rural Inequality and the Declining American Dream, published by the University of California Press, is the basis of this talk, and it explores rural inequalities in a community in Washington. It won the Rural Sociological Society Outstanding Scholarly Achievement Award last year, so join me in welcoming her to EOU in LaGrande.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you all so much for joining me tonight. I'm really happy and honored to have this opportunity to share some of my work with you. I will start by acknowledging that Washington State University, my employers, their locations statewide are on the homelands of Native peoples who've lived in the region from time immemorial. A lot of our Pullman campus is on territory, on land that is the Aboriginal territory of the Nez Perce and Palouse peoples. And I just want to acknowledge that indigenous lands were often taken by coercive and violent acts and the disregard of treaties. And for that, we at WSU extend our deepest apologies and owe our deepest gratitude to the Native peoples of our region. Well, thank you again for joining me tonight. As Matt said, my talk tonight is based on my 2021 book, Dividing Paradise, Rural Inequality and the Diminishing American Dream. I can only get through so much in 45 minutes, so I definitely encourage you to check out the book if you'd like to learn more about the issues that I'll be talking about tonight. So, as you've learned, my work mostly focuses on rural communities in the West, including a number with historical ties to the logging industry. And for this project, I was really interested in the transition from logging to amenity-focused tourism. And so today I'm going to tell a story that's very much about the changing fortunes of the rural West. And this was a region of the country that was originally tamed, in air quotes, through the efforts of Manifest Destiny. This is an ideology focused on bringing, again in quotes, civilization to what was believed at the time to be a sort of open and endless frontier, but was of course already inhabited. But nonetheless, development occurred throughout the West, beginning with things like small-scale agriculture, mining and logging. Later we see oil drilling, industrial agriculture. All of these industries really expanded into the mid-20th century. But then sometime in the mid-20th century, we start to see most of these industries decline, right? De-industrialization occurred, and these and other natural resource-based industries and economies collapsed and declined in the Northwest as they did throughout the nation. And in the wake of these types of decline, many rural communities have looked for new forms of economic development, and amenity-driven development was one of the sort of best ideas for a long time to replace some of those extractive industries in parts of the rural West, especially those areas that are desired for outdoor recreational activities, retirement, and second home ownership. Amenity development can have a number of positive impacts in terms of economic growth, but also some undesired side effects, as we're going to explore today. So among those are gentrification and the growth of inequality. So gentrification is a term you've probably heard of by now, hopefully. Until pretty recently, this was a concept that was really only applied to urban areas. And a sort of textbook definition is the process whereby the character of a poor area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing, and attracting new businesses, typically displacing current inhabitants in the process. And gentrification often has a number of unintended impacts, including rising housing prices, the changing nature of communities and businesses, and the systematic exclusion of both low-income individuals and people of color from what had previously been their own neighborhoods. And although recently this was a phenomenon that was sort of unheard of in rural communities, more recently, and really especially since the coronavirus pandemic, we do see it occurring in rural places as well, where we are similarly seeing the displacement of local people and rapid rises in housing prices. So you may have also heard of the phenomenon of Zoom towns after the pandemic, or sort of during the pandemic. This was just one example of the process as the pandemic made it a lot easier for urban dwellers to work remotely and relocate to scenic communities in the Northwest and across the nation. Not to mention lots of people wanted that second home in some out-of-the-way place in case this ever happens again and they need to flee the cities. But places that have been heavily affected by rural gentrification, you can think of communities like Bend, Oregon, or Sun Valley, Idaho, or Aspen, Colorado, right? All of these communities have in common that they were once pretty small working class communities, and they are now quite elite and quite expensive. So in a lot of rural communities, the shift from extractive industries to this heavier reliance on things like amenity tourism, second home ownership, and amenity in-migration creates social, cultural, and economic divides between well-resourced people that are moving in and often much less advantaged local groups who were there earlier. Gentrification often occurs as urbanites with higher incomes and often a lot more wealth, right, selling property in cities and things like that, purchase land in rural areas, both driving up prices and increasing scarcity. So my talk today is going to focus in on one rural Washington community that's facing this set of dilemmas. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce you to the community that I call Paradise Valley, Washington. All the names I'll use tonight are pseudonyms, but this is a real place, and this is just because it is qualitative research, and I'm trying to protect the privacy mostly of the individuals who spoke to me. So this is a community of about 5,000 mostly white residents. It is quite dependent at this point on tourism and amenity migrants, and a lot of second home ownership. So at the time that I did this research, now 10 years ago, about half of the local homes were owned by non-year-round residents. That number has skyrocketed, particularly since the pandemic. And nearly half of all the local employment at the time was in retail and accommodations and food services. These are industries that are deeply tied in with tourism. And the rise of tourism in this community began as early as the 1970s as Washington State's logging industry began to really collapse. In Paradise Valley, declines in resource-based industries, including logging, but also mining and ranching, were sort of balanced out in the late 20th and early 21st centuries by the rise of the recreation and tourism industries, which now really dwarf the land-based industries in their share of the local labor market. So basically, as Paradise Valley became known as a recreation destination, it attracted more and more second home owners and retirement migrants. And then as technology improved and allowed for more remote work and easier communication with friends and family elsewhere, we begin to see a rapid rise in even younger migrants who are often working age, frequently bringing children, right, their families with them, often with the idea that it was a better environment in which to raise their families. So to research this place, like I said, I'm a qualitative researcher, meaning I do a lot of in-person work where I'm studying the social world while participating in it. So I moved to this community full-time for 10 months from 2014 to 2015. And over that period, I conducted 84 open-ended, recorded, in-depth interviews. And that is a lot of what you'll be seeing tonight are just quotes from those interviews. But I also spent that whole time doing participant observation, so studying the social world while actually doing it, right, by being part of the community. And this had a lot of different moving parts for me. Some of it included regular volunteer jobs, including I worked, I think, 12 hours regularly every week between 3 locations, a food bank, a family support center, and a public library in the community. I also sort of did a lot of ad hoc volunteering for all sorts of local events and organizations and just tried to immerse myself in the community as much as I could during the time that I was there. So I made friends while I was there. I regularly went to yoga classes to get to know the sort of the higher social class folks. I went line dancing weekly, which I'm awful at, so I could interact with other members of the community. I went to galleries and theater performances and lectures and potlucks. I hiked and skied with local folks, and I helped people who were in need of help anytime I knew about it. So I just tried to get to know as many different aspects of life there as I possibly could and just become part of the fabric of this place. And through this research, I came to really understand that this community, Paradise Valley, was made up of 2 pretty distinct groups of people who really didn't interact a lot with each other, and they lived really separate lives within this one small community. And throughout this talk, I'm going to refer to them with these 2 labels, newcomers and old-timers. And I'll just apologize to you because these labels really sort of mislead and oversimplify the difference between these 2 groups. So they make it sound like it's about when you moved there, how long you've lived there, when in fact this difference is much more about social class, as I'll explain. So I adopted these terms mostly because it was what was used on the ground. These were the most common labels that they applied to one another. And most of the other labels that they commonly applied to each other were pretty derogatory, so this was my best bet. I try to use, sort of local understandings as much as possible. But these really were differences in social class, and they were differences that really mattered, right? The newcomers mostly had moved there more recently, not every single one of them, but by and large, they tended to have been there for less than 20 years. They tended to have a higher level of education. Mostly they had a BA or higher. They had higher levels of income, although income's a little truncated in this place because the labor market's pretty limited, so income was not really as much of an indicator of social class as it sometimes can be, but they had a lot more wealth. They often were, like I said, moving there with a lot of wealth. Politically, they were pretty homogeneously liberal. I think about 3/4 of folks that I called newcomers said that they voted regularly and democratic. And culturally, they had very specific interests in things like outdoor endurance sports, arts, literature. These were the folks that were competing in triathlons, going to book clubs. They were the ones going to the theater and the gallery openings and things like that. And they really contrasted with the old timers. And these were folks who tended to have been in the community a lot longer. I say here greater than 20 years just because that was the cutoff that was quoted to me over and over again. But a lot of these folks had been there their whole lives, if not for multiple generations. They tended to have much less education. They were much more likely to have less than a college degree. They tended to have lower incomes. A lot of them were either low income or poor, and a lot less wealth in general. They were more likely to be politically conservative, although they were not as homogenous in that as the newcomers. They were, more of them were more conservative, I would say, but a lot of them were pretty agnostic politically and just not that interested in politics, didn't really think it mattered or applied to them at all, at least at this time period. I think since then things have gotten a little bit more polarized. And then culturally, they had much more sort of working class backgrounds and interests. So they talked about enjoying things like hunting, fishing, horsebacking, snowmobile riding, video games, those kinds of things. So sort of really different backgrounds and interests between these two groups. And as I got to know people across the valley, I uncovered a number of different ways in which those differences that I just described made life a lot easier for the newcomers than it was for the old-timers. So in the book, I document the systematic ways in which this community's resources came to be really held by the newcomers to the exclusion of the old-timers. And in the book, I explore work in the labor market, right? Who has better access to the better jobs, housing and home ownership, who's better able to navigate a very constricted housing market, childcare and work-family balance, right? Just questions of, can you even afford to work? Can you find somebody safe to watch your kids? Social integration and kind of social power within the community. How well accepted do you feel in this place? How many friends do you feel like you have? And sort of related to that, I look at who gets aid, who receives aid, right? Who has help informally from others in the community. And finally, access to education, right? Whose kids are getting the best opportunities in school. And in today's talk, I'm going to really focus in on just these first two areas, just because I had to cut it off somehow. So we'll focus on work in the labor market and housing, but that social integration piece is going to be woven through, and you will hopefully see it in both of these sections. But really, in all of these arenas and lots more, the newcomers have access to resources that make it a lot easier for them to navigate the multiple challenges of living in a remote rural community. And I also discuss in the book the ways in which those same advantaged newcomers often fail to see their own privilege and the systematic disadvantages that the old-timers face. And this is a phenomenon that I call class blindness. And in the book, I describe class blindness as the tendency for those with social class privilege to be blind to their own advantages and to their impacts on less advantaged populations around them. And I argue that the failure to acknowledge these differences and the unequal access to power and opportunities that those differences create really undermines empathy and compassion for other people's struggles, and also just weakens our abilities to help those in need of it. So I'll try to point out class blindness as it sort of comes up in the rest of the talk. So starting first with work and the labor market, since the decline in the land-based industries and the transition to a more tourism-driven economy, Paradise Valley has seen growth in jobs in just a few sectors, and these include things like entertainment and recreation. Retail was also a significant employer, as was construction. That was a big one because somebody needs to build all the houses for the people moving in. And these are jobs that tend to have in common that they tend to be low paid, lacking benefits, seasonal, non-unionized, and a lot of them are less than full-time. And this is a really big contrast with those manufacturing and forest products related jobs of the past, right? Those tended to be more stable. A lot of them were year-round. Things like, lumber mills were year-round. A lot of them were unionized, and just living wage jobs where a single earner might be able to support a family. The result of these changes in the labor market have been just struggles for everyone to find decent work that can support families, particularly if you don't have a safety net of wealth or some sort of family help to fall back on. And so for newcomers moving there, this often meant what we call underemployment, right? Taking pay cuts, taking jobs that didn't fully utilize their education and training and job experience. They repeatedly described having to settle for lower salaries, fewer benefits, and longer hours than they might have had to somewhere else. And this is the case for Frank Brooks here, who said, certainly I cut my salary in half by moving here, and I turned down a job that was going to pay me a couple $100,000 more than that. That was hard, but we made that decision to move here. And it was a similar case for Anya Wilburn. She was a nurse who explained, here you have to be willing to accept less pay, to not have full benefits, to work way harder. Versus in the city, I could go and get triple the money, double the money at least, and have set call days. It's a totally different work environment in terms of a provider. It's rough out here. But nonetheless, newcomers tended to call upon their symbolic set of resources, right? They used their education, their previous work experience, their personal connections, and their cultural competence, basically human, social, and cultural capital, to find jobs that they found meaningful and rewarding. So here's Claire Woods talking about calling upon her own skills, right? She said, everybody who comes here starts a nonprofit, so I started a nonprofit. Never tried that before, and that attracted the attention of another nonprofit that was working on forestry and fire prevention, and they wanted me to work for them, so I got a better paying job for them, and that just kept leading to other things. So we've got some networking going on there, some human capital job skills. And Sean Murphy, who had worked in kind of high-powered industries before moving here, took a somewhat different tack. He said, I've always felt capable enough of doing whatever that I've never had to worry about getting a job. It's like, I'm happy to go do some physical labor thing. I can do construction. I have those tools. And there's construction here, no problem. I can do that. I didn't move here with any sort of plan on what I was going to do. So between their ease in finding work and their abilities to rely on reserves of wealth, such as savings and houses that were paid off, newcomers were able to live pretty comfortably in Paradise Valley and survive things like seasonal layoffs, which they often enjoyed because they got to go skiing for a couple of months or whatever. But that ease often meant that they struggled to understand people for whom things weren't so easy. So this is Sean, our carpenter, again, explaining people who say they can't find a job, like, that doesn't ring true to me. Finding a job that pays you enough to, say, buy land or a house, that's a different thing. So there's jobs available. I think there's a lot of people in the Valley who choose not to work those low-level jobs and instead choose to rely on assistance. I feel like if you have the initiative and then the human connections, the personal relationships that come with being here for a while, there's never a shortage of work to be done or found or created. But it does take initiative and somebody actually who's willing to bust ass and work hard. And so I feel like there are those opportunities, and sometimes there's a dearth of character as it relates to people willing to do those things. So we see here a real judgment of people who struggle, but also a bit of blindness with regard to his own privilege in terms of things like wealth and housing, that I'll return to a little later, but also education and social connections, all of which made it a lot easier for him to find work in this valley and to survive on the low wages that work provided. Turning now to the old-timers, it's a very different story. So they almost all struggled to make ends meet in Paradise Valley. They discussed problems with seasonal work and layoffs and the inability to make ends meet on the low wages that both seasonal work and service work provided. And unlike the newcomers, most old-timers were not ultimately satisfied with their outcomes in terms of job security, wages, hours, or the nature of the work itself. So Pam Rhodes, who was a surface worker, told me, it is way hand-to-mouth. It is not so good here. I am reluctant to make any changes even though I feel like I don't earn much more than a basic living wage, and I'm 57. So you know what that's going to look like when you try to retire. I mean, I'll have Social Security End of story, right? No savings if I keep at this job, but right now I would never dare to change. Mark Tate, who worked in retail, said, there's many people here that I know that have not just one good job, but they have like 3 or 4 jobs just to make ends meet, you know? The jobs are seasonal and some just don't pay well. And Owen Roberts put it very succinctly, it is really hard to find jobs here in the Valley, especially full-time jobs year-round. So rather than finding ways to just make it work, old-timers tended to discuss making really tough choices and sacrifices to their own basic needs. So this is Wes Thompson. He's a municipal employee, so he had one of the better jobs, but he said, yeah, it's tight, but we can survive. Once in a while, we'll have to go without the internet for a month or 2, maybe a couple weeks. But we got rid of a lot of stuff. We don't have satellite TV anymore. We just run local stations. We budget tight. My wife's really good about doing the budgets, figuring out what we need to do. We always have enough food to keep us going. But in order to make sure they had enough food, his family was heavily reliant on the food bank where I volunteered. In addition to these kinds of struggles and the need to make tough choices about what to live without, old-timers also often found that they lacked the types of skills and reputations and connections that would allow them to find some of the better jobs in the Valley. So often for old-timers, their local connections actually had kind of the opposite effect. People might remember them, they could remember mistakes that they had made in high school as teenagers. Sometimes it was mistakes that their larger families or clans had made, and they would often be judged as undesirable employees. And so my next quote comes from an unemployed man who had really deep roots in the Valley, but also a family with a kind of tarnished reputation. And although he was often looking for work, he really struggled to find any job stability in the Valley, and he was often homeless, and he felt that this reputation was a big part of his problem. He said, apparently, I've gotten a reputation around the Valley. I'm not sure how, as a drug dealer, a troublemaker. I look at him and I'm like, really? I'll take a drug test right now. I don't do drugs. It's like my dad was friends with a couple of drug dealers, and apparently they connected dots. I'm like, you can connect all the dots you want. It's not going to add up. But these multiple forms of disadvantage meant that old-timers were much more likely to struggle to find jobs and struggle to make ends meet on the seasonal and low-wage jobs that they were able to find. Moving now to the housing market, we see a very similar, if maybe even more extreme pattern. So, newcomers here, again, were at a major disadvantage. Most of them were moving there from urban areas where their homes were worth significantly more than property in the Valley, and this allowed them to purchase large and impressive homes, often with custom detailing and expansive views and large acreage. And for them, housing was rarely a major concern, and they frequently talked about just how affordable it was for them. So Roger Clark, who retired there, said, we inherited some money from my folks, and that helped buy this property. Along with my aunt, I got money from my aunt, and so that helped us. I think all in all, with her and my mom and dad's inheritance, and we bought this piece of land. Plus, we sold our home, we sold the 10 acres near Seattle, so all of that accumulated and helped us buy this place and have the money to build this home. So things worked out well for us in that respect. Here's Sean Murphy again, our carpenter, who explains a little bit more the secret of his success here. He said, I came here with a nest egg, but that was also the culmination of a lot of years of working towards that goal of building my own house, buying property. And so it's like I worked and I bought and sold a few things, all with the goal of getting to a place where I didn't have to. It's not like I'm retired, I'm nowhere near retired, but I wanted to get to a place where I didn't have to kill myself with a huge mortgage and force myself in that situation to work all the time. So as you might imagine, these types of stories really contrasted with those of the old-timers, for whom housing was one of the most serious struggles that they faced. And newcomers' failure to understand just how difficult housing was for old-timers was yet another way in which their class blindness really manifested. But the old-timers repeatedly described things like rising home values becoming just prohibitively expensive for people without significant wealth, which was most of them. Those rising values also meant increased tax burdens for current homeowners, really hurting those with limited cash flow. So I heard a lot about this from people who were either retired or about to retire, and were like, I don't know how we're going to possibly pay the tax bill. Those same rising rents, rising rents versus rising home values, rents were becoming unaffordable for those working in the service sector and those low-wage jobs, eventually getting to a point where now local rents are higher than the average wages at a service sector job. On top of all of that, landlords often expressed explicit preferences for newcomers and people moving there without children or pets. So somebody like me with a decent salary moving there temporarily without my family or my pets, I had many, many opportunities and offers of rentals for that year. And none of the people I interviewed had anything like that. None of the old timers that I interviewed had experienced anything like what I did, right? So there was a real bias in the housing market towards people that looked more like newcomers. And the result of all of this was a significant amount of housing stress and housing insecurity and even homelessness amongst the working class population. So here's just a few examples. Pam Rhodes, who we met a little earlier, said, there's definitely the haves and the have-nots. It is pretty hand-to-mouth for some segments of the community, and then other folks come in and, bless their hearts, but they have mommy's and daddy's blessings, and then they get things bought for them like homes and tractors and cars, and it's just a really different place than it used to be. Emmett Farley, who grew up in the Valley, said, that's one of the things that I find, really sad about here is it is so hard for young families to find affordable housing. It really sucks to grow up in an area, and by the time you're old enough and raising your own family, you can't do the same work that your parents did and still get by. Adeline Thompson, she's the wife of Wes that we met earlier talking about giving up cable, said, I'm always worried about the future. I didn't plan on spending almost 18 years in a single wide trailer. I wanted a house before I was 40. Never happened. And finally, Ryan Boyle, a stay-at-home father, said, I feel like I wasn't allowed to inherit my kingdom, Like I grew up here, I paid my dues. I thought everybody at least should get their acre, their house, just your chunk to make it. So as I've discussed, access to resources meant that newcomers and old-timers had very different experiences, as we've just seen, right? And although these huge differences existed in the level of real and symbolic resources between the two groups, without really knowing each other well, they frequently didn't understand the nature of each other's struggles. And in particular, the newcomers frequently judged the old-timers, often assuming that their troubles were the outcomes of individuals' poor choices or bad behaviors or a lack of moral values or work ethics, versus that they were the outcomes of these, systematic differences in their access to other types of resources. So while old-timers, and you'll see this in a minute, spoke at length about their own work ethics and their struggles to survive independently and without asking anyone for help, newcomers tended to describe them instead as lazy and drug addicts and welfare cheats. And I'll give you a few examples here. This was a local business owner, a newcomer, who said, rural communities can cut slack to some people that it allows them to be more dysfunctional. And then there's a fringe economy, and I'll just say this. You can drive around and you can see it. Small old travel trailers packed behind houses. And those are rental units. People are renting those out to people, and a lot of those people are doing things in exchange for their rent that are not good. Criminal activities of various sorts, whether it's drugs or whatever, prostitution. Right, so we see the conflating here of housing stress and criminal activity. And they had multiple negative understandings of the old-timers. Here's Claire Woods again saying, it seems to me that the ones who are born and raised here and stayed here and never left are pretty ignorant. And another retiree, Peter Williams, saying, there are mothers, young obese mothers with their babies that are living on food stamps, good chance their father isn't there anymore, there's domestic violence, unwed mothers, teen pregnancies. That stuff is going to happen to them and then to their kids. So he's more or less taken every negative stereotype you can think of for the poor and kind of placed it onto this entire group of people that he didn't know well. And although the old-timers tried really hard to counter those kinds of judgments through both their words and their actions, they were usually unsuccessful and often very well aware of those judgments, which, as you might imagine, often left them feeling kind of frustrated, excluded, and alone in their own community. Irene Nelson, who grew up there, said, "You're ending up with this social clash. Unfortunately, I really do see it different, like a class war starting to really develop. Before, nobody had a huge amount, but it was still within this broad band. Now you're seeing some folks up here, and they are very disdainful to everybody else." Martha Crawford, who'd lived her whole life there, said, "The community isn't the same as it used to be. Now it's all the people that moved from Seattle or Colorado, California, and it is a beautiful area to come and live in, I'll grant them that. But I wish they would just think a time or two about the people that lived here for so many years, kept things going. I like people, and I usually say good morning or hello or how are you or something, and I've had looks that looked at me like, oh, I don't know you." And this was something I heard about so much, the loss of the wave. I don't know how many times I heard people talk about how terrible it felt to no longer be the recipient of that wave in the rural community, that they just were treated as if they were invisible now. And this sense of exclusion was noted even by old-timers who really actively tried to reach out to the newcomer community and get involved with it, but they often described feeling kind of snubbed. So Megan Wicker, a stay-at-home mom, said, "When I used to go to church with my friend outside of the valley, I felt very supported, like they wanted to save me and they wanted to help me and they would help me anyway. And then when I went with my recent friend here, I don't know if it was just the church or the people that go to the church, but I felt more like pushed away, like I wasn't somebody they wanted in their church. I just felt kind of awkward there, like I wasn't one of them." And this is another stay-at-home mom, Allison Lloyd here, talking about why she gave up trying to be part of the PTA. She said, "So everybody has in a small town, everybody has their own views of you. I really don't care what people think of me, but I guess it does hinder me from doing stuff, though, too, that I don't want to, I guess it's easier to just, I can know what they think about me all day long, but having to go deal with it is another thing." Okay, so as I mentioned, newcomers and old-timers, right, had these really different levels of real and symbolic resources. And as you see in these stories, those differences manifest through multiple means and get reinforced through these symbolic resources as well as, money and wealth itself. So I just want to kind of walk us through some of these differences, right? Social capital is one of the main ways that these differences get reinforced, that this divide gets reinforced. So newcomers created these dense social networks, these vibrant social networks that often offered wraparound support to those who were like them. They offered each other all sorts of help. They shared childcare burdens, they shared equipment, right? Help if you needed medical care, all of those kinds of things. But meanwhile, old-timers increasingly had not a lot of people to rely upon, and they were systematically excluded from those well-resourced social networks. So not only were the old-timers often feeling increasingly socially isolated, but the people that they had in their own social circles tended to lack resources to share, right? They didn't have a lot of time because they were working jobs that were unforgiving. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of goods to offer, et cetera. So we see social capital as one of the dividing lines. Cultural capital also played a really important role, right? I described earlier the difference in kind of taste and preferences and interests between the two groups, but the newcomers used those differences to really police social class boundaries without ever naming them as such or admitting to recognizing social class at all. But their social capital, their social networks were built upon these cultural differences, right? They hung out with other people who did the stuff they liked to do. And this made total sense to them, right? Why would I hang out with somebody who's not interested in the same thing? Those common activities and shared interests became this main avenue by which new immigrants were rapidly absorbed into their social networks, and they often found immediate support there. And meanwhile, again, old-timers often experienced judgment and outright ostracization in newcomers' social and cultural spaces, which were often both culturally exclusive and often financially expensive. So just really difficult for them to access it all. And it was difficult to build that kind of cultural capital without that access. Human capital sees some of the same issues just playing out for the next generation, where newcomers' children were encouraged in school and supported by parents and teachers, while old-timers often felt that their children were judged, ignored, or targeted by teachers and administrators. And those parents with less education often had less comfort and knowledge in navigating the educational environment. They had less help to offer their own kids through things like college application processes because they hadn't been through it themselves, but they didn't get nearly as much support from the schools themselves. In addition, at the time that I was doing this research, the schools also charged extra fees for extracurricular activities, including sports and what they called enrichment classes, so art or music, things like that. And this, again, resulted in old-timers' kids' exclusion from things that could have been their way to access that same kind of cultural capital. Later on, we'd see in the labor market that old-timers would be judged as inferior employees for having less education and less human capital. And then finally, talk about moral capital. So some of you may have heard of this, some of you may have not. For old-timers, this was the one resource that they could still really access. So moral capital is something that I've documented in rural communities, and it's basically a form of symbolic resource that's created through outward displays of things like work ethics, self-sufficiency, family values, things like that. And my research here found that the old-timers, like a lot of people in small and remote rural communities, were still very attached to this form of symbolic capital, and they worked really hard to prove themselves as morally worthy through things like self-sufficiency, refusing help, and outwardly performing and displaying their values and choices. But these displays often kind of fell on deaf ears, right? Because the newcomers barely interacted with them and weren't paying a lot of attention and mostly just kind of judged them, as we've seen, as morally lacking without really reading these attempts as anything, worth paying attention to. And newcomers, on top of that, really didn't trade in this form of capital, right? They weren't offering anything for people who could prove that they were morally upstanding. So moral capital sort of ceased to have any real exchange value in Paradise Valley, and instead it became more of a negative force in the old-timers' lives as those in power kind of assumed that they were morally unworthy and didn't recognize the capital as exchangeable anyways. So it became yet another way in which the old-timers were disadvantaged relative to the newcomers. So in the end, Paradise Valley was this really divided community in which these two groups had very little in common and didn't interact a lot and really didn't understand each other's experiences, which were very different. And this meant that the one group was able to systematically amass the bulk of the community's resources amongst themselves while simultaneously blaming the other group for its lack of resources. And so I argue that the failure to see and respond to social class inequality, right, this class blindness, has multiple negative impacts on a community like Paradise Valley. And in the book, I really dig into this self-perpetuation of inequality, right, as the one group dominates the community's best jobs and the community's best housing. They have more access to reliable childcare. They have better educational access for their children. They have more social support and more power within the community. And the other group becomes increasingly disempowered and marginalized within the place that was their own home. And I find that it results in these patterns of exclusion and dehumanization on the one side and frustration and anger on the other, as you might imagine. And in the book, I also explore the increasing divide in worldviews and understanding between the two groups, finding that they really just don't understand or relate to each other. And probably most disturbingly for me was that they didn't really want to interact with each other a lot, and thus undermined the social cohesion that has long been associated with rural communities as one of the big benefits of living in a small town. So in the book, I I dig into this decrease in social cohesion and the loss of concern for fellow residents on the other side of the social divide. And like I said, even people who truly wanted to help the less fortunate, this was fascinating to me, didn't actually want to interact directly with those individuals. So it was a whole new way of helping those in need that looked much less like what I was used to in rural communities, like we'll all band together and help this family, and much more like I'll give money to a third party that will then take care of that problem so that I don't have to know those people. And beyond that, I did document political and cultural divisions between the two groups and just a failure to see the world in similar ways at all. So I find that this social divide not only undermines people's abilities to care about and directly help one another, but it does bleed into these other areas like politics, where the residents of Paradise Valley, just as in other gentrified rural communities, or really the US more generally, have become increasingly divided and hostile towards each other. So this is kind of a dark talk. I try to end on a somewhat positive note and get us to think about what can be done with these kinds of problems. And one of the things I argue is that healing social divides, both in a community like Paradise Valley and in a larger nation like the US, requires a combination of micro and macro level efforts to support healthy families and healthy relationships between residents. And I think that's super important because it's really easy to come away from this talk blaming these individuals because it's their voices that you just heard, and sometimes they don't come across so great. But a lot of them are really, really good people who have no idea what they're doing. But also, this is not necessarily an individual problem, right? The larger problem here is about social class inequality in our nation, and so we have to think of it on the large scale as well as the small scale. So it is important, I think, to think about federal as well as state level policies that can even the playing field and address social class inequality, right? Give everybody equal chances to actually support a family, to make it through work. So that can take different forms. It can look like public policies that support all families and adults, right? Things like healthcare, childcare, housing support. It might look like, if we don't want to provide those things, maybe just thinking about the labor market and whether or not it provides living wages that can actually, support people to buy those types of things on the open market. Secondly, on the community scale, I think, this community was really, really proactive in trying to help its own. And a lot of communities are, especially in this, this day and age where we're seeing such vast amounts of need and inequality in our communities. But one of the insights that I had from particularly my volunteer work there was that charitable and local aid efforts that work to build relationships and connections between more and less advantaged residents can really help to build trust and understanding and empathy along with providing help. And so there are different models for this, and I've worked in a lot of different food banks, and I've seen sort of the gamut from like handing somebody a bag and pushing them out the door after you've taken a number from them, and also places like the one I saw in this community where it was one of the few places where you really actually saw connections being made, where they tried really hard to humanize the encounters, to make sure that the volunteers who were sort of across the class spectrum, but we're treating each individual as a human being, listening to their needs, spending time getting to know them, not just making it this sort of humiliating experience where they then hang their head, but in fact a social interaction where they felt heard and seen and wanted to come back the next time. So those are relatively easy to implement strategies that can make a big difference both in terms of the relative amounts of need in a community and in terms of people actually getting to know each other and being able to see that person as an individual versus just a category. And then finally, at the individual level, there is room for probably each of us as individuals to check our assumptions about other groups of people and try to get to know them before judging other people. So I think about, trying to reach out to people we encounter through our social institutions, right? Schools, churches, kids' sports matches, and and basically just resisting the urge to immediately gravitate towards those who are most like us, which is really easy to do, but make some effort to, spend some time getting to know the people that seem the least similar to us, which can kind of help enrich everybody's everyday lives and hopefully our larger communities. So that's all I got. I'll end there and then open up for questions. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if people knew why you were there. I mean, you mentioned ways that you tried to integrate in the community, but did they also know you were working on this book?
Yeah, I was very open with everybody and tried to be extremely clear, particularly in places where I was working regularly. I was really, really clear with them, sometimes gave them copies of my old book so they understood kind of what I do more generally. That said, not everybody could understand who I was or what I was doing, if that makes sense. You can tell people they don't always hear it the same way. I had many friends who assumed I was a student at the time, although I was tenured faculty already. I remember one of my buddies at the food bank, after I'd been there about 9 months, I came in one day and he was treating me really different. And I was like, "What's up today?" And he said, "Is it true you're a college professor?" I said, "Yeah, you knew that." He said, "No, I didn't. I've never met a college professor." And then for the rest of it just took so long for him to calm down and this, treating me differently, and he had all sorts of questions. So yeah, I tried to make sure people understood what I was doing and that they understood when they weren't on the record and things like that. So anyone who took part in an interview went through a consent process and signed forms and had everything explained to them. People who were active in just the ethnographic part, the everyday life, still knew who I was, but as you probably saw, there's not many quotes directly from that because in general, I didn't like to take people's words unless I had their permission to do so.
So was it hard to build trust?
Yes, but weirdly more among the newcomers than the old-timers, which surprised me, I think, because I don't know that I went in really even understanding that there would be such a newcomer community. I thought of this place as more of a tourism, than second home ownership, but when I realized there were all these in-migrants, I thought, oh, this will be easy, right? They're more like me, they're educated, they're middle class, et cetera, liberal. Those people were suspicious. They didn't love me. It took a long time to get to know a lot of them. I had a few that I just clicked with right off the bat who became friends and really tried to help me, get to know more people, but they were a pretty closed off group in a lot of ways, versus the old timers were a lot friendlier. I've spent a lot of my life in rural communities. I could connect with those folks easily, and they just, they were just happy to have somebody listen to them and spend time with them.
And is it correct to assume that the racial composition didn't change much? You said that it was predominantly white community.
It's really white. Yeah, very white. Much more so than probably most rural places that I've been or studied, in part because they had, in the mid-20th century, moved the native population off to a reservation that was less desirable space. So yeah, it's really white, and there is sort of a Hispanic population nearby, but they can't afford to live in this place. Thanks.
I'm curious about time and how you think that what you looked at would be different if, the newcomers were actually a small minority as opposed to a predominant thing.
Yeah.
Like those the capitals, it's very odd to hear newcomers being described as the ones having the capital. Yeah. And, the old timers not, whereas most people, in my experience, they're the ones with the capital. The folks that are, born and raised and.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think absolutely maps onto the community's history. So there's a few folks in there that, were sort of old-timers who'd lived there longer than 20 years, who'd been there a lot longer, some of them. Newcomers who'd been there a lot longer. there was a wave in the 70s of kind of hippie back to the landers, and those folks described a really different experience when they first moved there, where they were much more integrated into the larger community, because as they described it, there weren't any other options, right? There was not like a brew pub versus a bar. You went to the bar, right? They were much more integrated in the community, and people described it as kind of going that way until really the kind of late 90s, early 21st century was when you sort of hit this critical mass where the newcomers started to take over little bit by little bit and change the nature of businesses. And I mean, it's ramped up at a level now that is just almost unimaginable to me, because I've been, visiting this place for 15 years. And it's changed a ton in that period of time, where a lot of the businesses that once catered to the working class community have been sort of pushed out of business, and now everything is really focused on either tourists or this kind of just high-end stuff, high-end pastries and high-end drinks and high-end food and high-end clothing, all of that stuff. So we're just kind of seeing it change in real time, but absolutely that was how people described it when they moved there in the late 20th century was, we were not in control here. We were not desired here. But when you get enough of them, they win.
I have maybe two questions. One, I was curious, just connecting it to higher ed, if there were conversations around kind of children and, the connection to access to, social mobility, if there was things around. That's all. Maybe I'll just ask that, and then if I can ask my other question.
Yeah. I think I started those conversations in the sense that I would ask people specifically. I'm not sure it came up that often on its own. And it was depended on who you were talking to. So there were lots of newcomers who didn't see any problem with the way things were and just thought, well, those families don't have the same goals or interests that my family has, so why should we care what their kids are doing, and why should we, right? They don't care, and that was sort of the understanding, versus a lot of the old timers themselves felt like their kids were being denied opportunities. They were really concerned about the way they were being treated in school, and they often had kind of multi-generational wounds around this, where they themselves had been treated poorly in school and treated like they were bad kids, or there was a lot of talk of learning disabilities that had gone untreated in the schools and things like that. So a lot of those parents really wanted to see their kids excel in school in ways that they hadn't, but they didn't quite know how to make that happen. And then, parents would describe their own kids just reproducing this divide within the schools, where they would say, well, of course, all of his friends' parents are just sort of like us, that all the moms have MAs or PhDs, and it's just they have more in common. So there's a lot of that language of sort of like what you had in common being the explanation for reproducing inequality.
Thank you. That's what I was wondering in terms of like that reproduction on an individual level, and then on a systemic by just kind of letting things occur the same way over time. And then I was also thinking about, as a college professor, and you identify the three things that we can do on an individual, and when we think about higher education and how our systems are very built and class and hierarchies are very ingrained into those practices, that often disadvantage economically, really disadvantaged students who come from low income backgrounds. Like, what would be your thoughts around how we could be intentional in looking at ways to support those types of access for individuals, families, and communities?
Yeah, thank you. One of the like kind of low-hanging fruit pieces of progress that this community's made since I left, well, there were two that I was like really happy to hear about. One was finally doing away with those pay-to-play fees, which to me was one of the most insane things I'd ever heard of, and I didn't realize at the time that this was relatively common for school districts that are struggling to just pass the economic burden on to the parents. And that was just such an obvious way in which inequality was getting reproduced, right? You just don't allow access, and when I would talk to people about it, they'd say, well, I mean, there are scholarships available. The Booster Club has a process by which those kids can ask for money. A lot of them didn't know about it. The kids were embarrassed to talk about it. They didn't, the parents often didn't know that that was an opportunity, but the kids were embarrassed to even have to ask for help. So just getting rid of any kind of barrier like that it seems like the obvious first step, which I was really grateful to hear that they had done. But then beyond that, it took outreach, right? So in this community, as I mentioned, the upper class folks are really into skiing. And it's not that other families don't want to learn how to do that, but that's an expensive sport. It requires equipment. It requires some lessons. It's not just something you could pick up. And so the school did start finding ways to be more inclusive in their ski lessons and ski team and things like that by just starting an equipment exchange so that they were getting used equipment and making sure that every kid could have skis. They started providing the lessons so it wasn't just available to kids who already knew how to ski and things like that. So there's some degree to which you just have to figure out where is the deficit and address it. One of the other issues that they've made some, but not as much progress as I would have liked to see on was the issue of childcare, which was just a massive, massive emergency level problem in this valley, and I heard about it from everybody, but really, a lot of old-timer women talked about just being out of the workforce entirely because they couldn't find safe childcare for their children, and they had these horror stories where their kids were abused by people who weren't licensed and stuff like that, but it was all that was affordable to them. And so there was a push to create more sort of early education and childcare opportunities, and early on, it wasn't clear how inclusive that was going to be, so they did manage to at least create a number of slots that made sure they were going to people who needed financial help. And again, I think that was like one more way that you can free up a few folks to actually go to work and build their own human capital, as well as putting their kids in contact from a really early age. But these are sort of small changes to really big problems. So, thanks.
Any other questions? Oh.
Yeah.
What were the groups or organizations that you observed were implementing these changes that you just mentioned that were most effective?
Let's see. Well, pay to play, that's through the school district itself, and so that was something that they had talked about at the time and just hadn't implemented, that they were aware that it was a problem and that it was creating inequalities, but it took them a while, another 5 years or so to address it. I'm trying to remember the child care. I think that might have been started through a combination of nonprofits that included local nursery school and, so a few different groups, the Family Support Center, sort of a whole bunch of them pitched in together to get this thing off the ground because they had a couple of daycares that closed within a few years of each other, so really nobody had child care, and it was really becoming a crisis situation. But this place, it has these amazing resources of human capital, right? Because you've got all these people with all these, job skills, education, all looking for something to do with their time. And so they have been really successful at mobilizing around their issues in ways that a lot of other rural communities wouldn't be able to because they have so many resources. It's really just about, trying to get them to understand the full picture and make sure that these solutions they come up with are inclusive of everybody. There's certainly been a lot of attempts that I kind of scratch my chin at, where they're like, we're going to build affordable housing, but it's affordable for them and not, not for people working like a retail job and things like that. Thanks. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.